All right, welcome to our lecture on boundary disputes. The slides were by a gentleman named David Palmer. I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for today's lecture. So let's go ahead and dig in. We talk about boundary disputes. There's really four different kinds of boundary disputes, and we'll talk about each one in turn here. So the first one we want to talk about is we're going to start talking about those territorial ones or the definitional ones. And if you have the graphic organizer in front of you, what you're looking for is that row that's talking about definitional boundary disputes. And what these focus on is the legal language of the agreement is a way of determining exactly who owns which piece of land. So it's very much focused on what's been negotiated in the past, what is the agreement, what do the words themselves mean, as a way of deciding where is that boundary, that border going to go. And a great historical example of this would be arguably talk about the U.S.-Mexican War in the 1840s and talk about whether the boundary was going to be the Rio Grande or I think it's the Platte River was the other option. I could be wrong. Please don't quote me on that. But either way, there was another river that was 10 or 15 miles further inland into what is now the state of Texas in terms of what was that border going to be. And so there was a dispute talking about which river, when they said the border is the river, which river are we actually talking about? Okay, so that's kind of, we're focusing on the language of the agreement. And oftentimes you find these, especially when we're talking about older borders where things used to be listed out using landforms as landmarks, so that, for example, the crest of the Andes Mountains is a source of border dispute between Chile and Argentina, and Chile and some of its neighbors. Okay, but when you've got inexact definitions like that, like which mountains actually form that crest, okay, that's when we start getting into what does the language actually mean. Okay, our second type of border disputes are positional or locational border disputes, and these focus on the delimitation and the demarcation of the border. So to delimit the border is to draw it on a map. Okay, so it focuses on where are we drawing the border on the map. And then to demarcate means to mark it on the ground itself. Okay, so great example of demarcating the border, for example, since we're in Western Washington State, would be the Peace Arch between the United States and Canada, right? That's a way of demarcating where is the border. Delimiting, on the other hand, if we're looking at a map, it's where we draw the border along that 49th parallel between the U.S. and specifically Washington State and Canada. Okay, so what comes down to here is that it's not the definition. We can agree on what the words themselves say, but it's the interpretation of that definition that's a problem. So it could be that, we say the desert, or we say, well, the desert's going to be the boundary. Well, what do we mean when we're talking about the desert? Which part of the desert is going to be the boundary? And this is if we're talking about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, right? As an example of a boundary dispute. And this is where it comes in. We've kind of got to look at it, and our map shows it as a very clear line, but if you look at it closely, says that there is no really defined boundary. Okay, and this matters in the case of Saudi Arabia and Yemen because there's a lot of oil buried underneath the soil there. Okay, and so that becomes a problem because depending on where the border is, that's going to make a big difference in how much oil people can expect to take out and whether they have, which country has access to which oil fields potentially, and things like that. Okay, so these things can make a big difference. And you could see these, for example, if we talk about, say, a river that changes course. And so we can agree that the river is the boundary, but is it the original course of the river or is it the new course of the river that forms the boundary, and things like that. Okay. So our third type of border disputes are what are called functional or operational border disputes. Okay, and this literally has to do with how is the border going to function? In other words, how are we going to get people and goods across the border from one side to the other in order to facilitate trade and migration? And a great modern example of an ongoing border conflict is between the United States and Mexico. Okay, so there are some things that go across the border very, very easily. for example, with NAFTA, trade across the border and trade goods goes relatively easy across the border, right? Because there's not a lot of taxes and there's some searches and stuff, but it's not as complicated as it could be. But if we're talking about migration, for example, that's a huge area of conflict along the border, and especially those states that are right next to the border, and then talking with the federal government about enforcement and things like that. Okay. In the aftermath of September 11th here in Washington, there was a functional, or really an operational, border dispute with Canada about how are we going to get trucks and people and things back and forth, and the fact that it was easier to get into Canada than it was to get out of Canada. And if you didn't have the right kind of paperwork with you, then you couldn't get into Canada. So I know I worked in Bellingham at the time at a hotel, and we had people on a semi-regular basis who would come in, and Bellingham, if you're not familiar, is about half an hour, 45 minutes from the border tops, and people would come back because we're the first major town of any large size, and they would come back and stay in the hotel while they called somebody to get, their birth certificate or their passport brought up or something like that. So those are examples of operational border disputes, right? So it's not about where's the border, it's not about figuring out on the map or on the ground where is it. It's about that transportation, getting people and things back and forth across the border. Okay. Resource disputes or allocational disputes really have to do with resources, oftentimes, not always, resources that are under the ground. Okay, that are mineral resources. Water, though, is a great example of what is oftentimes an above ground allocational dispute. And what these come down to is who gets how much of the resource. That's really the question that happens. So if we're talking, for example, about oil fields that, say, run under boundaries, like we were talking about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or we talk about Iraq and Kuwait in the early 1990s, right? Who decides how much of what resource to get? So with Iraq and Kuwait in the early 1990s, Iraq literally invades Kuwait, and one of the reasons that they give is they feel like Kuwait is taking too much oil from their side of this oil field that spans the border, and as a result, what's going on is they're causing oil to drain from the Iraqi side, and then they're being able to use and exploit that extra oil, right? In addition to some complaints having to do with whether or not Kuwait was digging wells on the on the diagonal, essentially, and in the process actually digging across the border underneath the soil. Because remember when we're talking about borders, that it's not just the line on the ground, it's also all the way up into the air and all the way down underneath the ground. And that's where those arguments about resources and mineral resources in particular come into play, right? And we got to negotiate, figure out who gets how much. If we want to talk about water disputes, there's a lot of disputes tend to be around rivers and water migration. So for example, the Colorado River runs through much of the Southwest United States, and in each state, people take some of the water. Well, what does that mean for the folks who live downstream, right? Who don't then have access to as much water? And what happens if somebody builds a dam and just decides that they're going to use the Colorado River really to generate hydroelectric power? What does that mean for all those folks who live downstream who now don't have access to as much water for things like salmon or for irrigation or for similar sorts of things, right? We want to go international, talk about international disputes. We could talk about the, what's the big river in Vietnam and Cambodia? At any rate, you can look it up. And there's really huge disputes about we're going to build dams along this river. And in particular with China building dams on their part of the river, what does that then mean for the folks who live downstream? Who again, now what was a functional river that they could use for irrigation, that they could use to wash their clothes, that they could use to drink, that the fish would swim in. Now the volume of water is less, and arguably the quality of water is less, right? Because there's less water to be able to wash the silt and various other things that get into the river downstream and out to the ocean, and that becomes a problem. So in our lecture today, what we've really talked about. Actually, I lied. There's one more I want to talk about. We did talk a little bit again about the Colorado River, and if you look at it, the Colorado River starts way up north of the Grand Canyon and flows through, right, a variety of places, and each one of those tributaries, each one of those rivers, again, takes off some of the water. So what does it mean if we put a dam at Lake Mead? What does that mean for our folks in the Grand Canyon? Right now there are times of the year where the Colorado River barely flows through the Grand Canyon because of that dam built at Lake Mead. So to kind of sum up, sorry about that, we've talked about 4 different kinds of boundary disputes. We talked about allocational disputes, which again have to do with the location and use of resources. We talked about positional disputes, which have to do with the literal location of the border. Okay, where is it going to be on the map? Where is it going to be on the ground? We talked about definitional disputes, which have to do with understanding the language of the treaty. And we talked about, pardon me, I'm going to cheat here, functional disputes, which have to do with literally how the border itself operates, getting people and getting things over the borders. So you should have enough information to fill in most, if not all, of your graphic organizer. Anything you don't should be easy enough to do some quick research on. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to bring them into class and ask, and I will see you the next time we meet.